One of the reasons that Stanley Kubrick's films seem to have such a lasting impact, I think, is that they're not simply about the moment when they're created. One of the main conflicts in Doctor Strangelove does have to do with the concerns of the day. This is not too long after the Cuban Missile Crisis. There is a lot of paranoia about the possibility of nuclear conflict. Kubrick himself was really worried that there are all these nuclear bombs out there, and one little slip up could mean the end of life as we know it. So, in a sense, the movie is about that very contemporary concern, but it goes beyond that. And it has this symbolic dimension. It's really about the future of humanity. It's our failure to recognize the humanity in other people that leads to all sorts of problems. And part of what explains that is the mythological qualities of the film. Kubrick's films seem to be drawing upon mythological figures, mythological structures, even though that may not be immediately apparent. I think thinking about them in terms of mythology might help us to understand why a film like Doctor Strangelove speaks to something more fundamentally human. We know that Kubrick was a voracious reader and essentially a self-taught intellectual. And of the many, many, many books that he read a lot of Jung, he read a lot of Freud, and he read Joseph Campbell. We know that he gave Arthur C. Clarke a copy of The Hero with a Thousand Faces when they were working together in the mid-60s. So I think it's fair to assume that immediately prior to that, when Kubrick was working on Dr. Strangelove, he was already aware of Campbell. And Campbell, for me, provides a kind of entry point into understanding how Jungian archetypes work in mythology. Often when we think about myths and mythology, we think about supernatural creatures like gorgons and hydras, things like that. But by myth, I mean simply stories that speak to the fundamental human conflicts, the search for understanding our place in the universe. So myths attempt to help us grapple with these irresolvable questions about the human condition and come to terms with them in symbolic ways. There are some critics who reject this kind of approach to looking at films in general, who would suggest that, Campbell's hero's journey, or this idea of the hero with a thousand faces, is too simplistic, and that if stories are simply following this formula and hitting certain points, then somehow that they're not complex. I don't think that's what's happening. I don't think many filmmakers say, okay, here's my story, now let me make it conform to these things. And Kubrick certainly was not doing that. And Campbell points out that, humans from all different historical eras and all different parts of the world share the same basic anatomy and physiology. Why not the same basic mental structures as well? It doesn't seem like such a leap to think that there are these psychological forms or the capacity for understanding these forms and relating to questions of morality and philosophy through those common forms. Jung and Freud saw a lot of value in dream analysis, and they found that their troubled patients were having dreams that were very similar in quality. Jung especially noted that these same kinds of figures would appear in the dreams of one patient after another, and he identified these as what he called archetypes. Now, there are dozens and dozens of archetypes, but there are some that are more common than others, and one of the most common archetypes is the shadow. And the shadow is in some ways analogous to Freud's concept of the id. It's that part of the personality that we don't really want to acknowledge. So the killer instinct, for example, is something that is down there in our psyche somewhere. A lot of Kubrick's films, some of them even explicitly talk about the duality of man, the dual nature of man. Man is both an animal and a higher level being. How is it that we can create great symphonies and yet we're always trying to kill each other at the same time? How can humanity be so horrible and so misguided? Campbell would say the stories that are worth telling are the stories that grapple with those kinds of issues, something beyond normal human experience. Aside from Paths of Glory, where we do have a pretty clear hero figure, a lot of Kubrick's other protagonists are what we might call anti-heroes or flawed heroes or failed heroes. Campbell's ideas allow for that. There is always the flip side or the opposite side of the hero. The hero doesn't always triumph in mythological stories. Campbell talks about the story of Siegfried, who slays the dragon and assimilates that dragon power into himself. But the hero doesn't always kill the dragon. Sometimes the dragon kills the hero, and the hero is left in fragments then to be somehow resurrected. So more often than not, I think Kubrick gives us the sort of anti-hero who may fail. And I think Dr. Strangelove offers a series of potential heroes, but they all fail.
Major Kong, message from base confirmed.
The two figures in Strangelove who are closest to a classical hero are Major Kong.
Well, boys, I reckon this is it. Nuclear combat toe-to-toe with the Ruskies.
But I've got a very good idea what the recall code is, and I have to get in touch with SAC headquarters immediately.
And Mandrake. Mandrake is operating out of some kind of humanistic values. He wants to save lives, he wants to avoid war, he wants to figure out the problem of the recall code, and he ultimately is able to do that.
May I tell you that I have a very, very good idea. I think, I hope, I pray what the recall code is.
It's just that he's too late. So that's not enough in this situation. On the flip side, we have Major Kong, who is in some ways a very heroic character. Now, even though we may not agree with his objective, Campbell would say that doesn't diminish the heroism of what he and his crew are doing. They know that they're not coming back from this mission. Even though Kubrick is kind of lampooning the Major Kong character, in a sense, Kong is a kind of failed hero, because he's not really operating out of his own humanity. He's operating out of his place in this system of authority that says, you must do this. I wouldn't say that Kubrick's films necessarily follow exactly point by point the way that Campbell describes the hero's adventure. The idea that it's essentially the same basic story told again and again and again, and we have to keep revisiting the story because it's never resolved. I don't think Kubrick would ever be that formulaic, but I think he is operating on a mythological level. Dr. Strangelove is tricky to think of, especially if we're thinking about the hero figure, because there is no single protagonist, and so a lot of these conflicts are disseminated among the various characters and their situations. But if you think about, say, General Ripper and Mandrake, in a way they are opposites. And Mandrake, he's a kind of variation of the helper archetype, or in some myths, it's a kind of advisor archetype. And he ends up being kind of a foil for Ripper.
Jack, don't you think we'd be better off in some other part of the room away from all this flying glass?
No, we're okay here.
Ripper is very hawkish. He's gung-ho about this attack. Mandrake, even though he's a career military officer, he's much more peaceful. He's what we would nowadays call a dove.
You know, after all, let's face it, we don't want to start a nuclear war unless we really have to, do we?
Ripper and Mandrake provide one example of this kind of opposition that we find among characters. The relationship between General Turgidson and the president is really interesting. In a way, we might see them as opposites. I mean, Turgidson is the one who is ready to go all out.
We were to immediately launch an all-out and coordinated attack on all their airfields and missile bases. We'd stand a damn good chance of catching them with their pants down. Hell, we got a 5-to-1 missile superiority as it is. We could easily assign 3 missiles to every target.
Strangelove is a fascinating character. He reminds me a lot of the archetype that Jung called the trickster.
Under the authority granted me as Director of Weapons Research and Development,
He is constantly scheming and designing things, and we sort of learn that Strangelove has been thinking about designing his own doomsday machine. He's been studying this possibility.
I would not rule out the chance to preserve a nucleus of human specimens.
Even though he's supposed to be a kind of advisor figure, he's the one who ultimately leads everybody down the path to doom, literally. So ultimately the anti-hero of the film.
Hello, Dimitri. Listen, I can't hear too well. Do you suppose you could turn the music down just a little? Oh, that's much better. Yeah.
I see the president as a kind of mediating figure between all of these impulses. He's not gung-ho to go to war, but he realizes that in certain situations, death may be necessary in order for the greater good.
It's a friendly call. Of course it's a friendly call.
As when the president is willing to sacrifice the lives of the bomber pilots in order to avert an all-out nuclear war.
They will not reach their targets for at least another hour.
This is anathema to Turgidson, who's horrified at that idea.
Well, we're just gonna have to help you destroy them, Dimitri. I know they're our boys.
So there is a kind of opposition between them, but the president seems to be more of an even-keeled, central kind of figure. And Turgidson is, in many ways, a kind of child archetype. He seems almost ashamed of the phone call that comes in. He's like a naughty little child who's almost caught by daddy.
Talk to you now, but my president needs me.
These are basic human forms that find their way into mythological stories, and they're very powerful. They find different inflections in different cultures, but there is a commonality that allows us to relate to stories from other cultures and stories from other times.
The boys must have surrendered.
Well, there it is.
Ripper is essentially the father of his men.
Let's recall the winger.
Of course, Ripper is a failed father archetype.
Boys were like my children, Mandrake.
Ultimately, his problem is his own sexual insecurity.
I first became aware of it, Mandrake, during the physical act of love.
Huh.
Yes, a profound sense of fatigue, a feeling of emptiness followed.
It's Ripper's own sexual inadequacies that leads him to all these theories about the communist conspiracy, the fluoridation of water, and so forth. This is classical psychological projection, right? My problems can't be because of me. It must be because of those people over there. And that's played out pretty obviously through the dialogue and also the symbolism of the cigar and things like that. Dr. Strangelove is rife with Freudian imagery. Freud was all about sexual repression and sexual imagery. We can't really miss the sexual imagery in the opening credits of the planes refueling. The bombs. I would say that what Kubrick is trying to do is to give us a kind of uncommon experience of character through the visual style of his films, so that the style of the film enhances our emotional experience. He emphasizes the idea of duality quite often through symmetrical compositions, as we see in so much in Paths of Glory, the regimental symmetry. Everything has its opposite right there in the frame. We see a little bit of that in Dr. Strangelove, the fact that General Turgidson's office is mirrored and we're not sure which direction he's coming from. To me, that suggests a kind of duality. I think once Kubrick puts us in that mindset of thinking symbolically about the film, then that allows the film to open up to these other dimensions for us. It allows us to see the film as being much more than just a character study of these fictional people. Dr. Strangelove is full of images of death and resurrection. The end of that film has always been a little bit of a mystery to me. The nuclear bombs going off with the song, "We'll Meet Again." It works immediately as a kind of ironic punchline, there's no doubt about that, but it serves multiple functions as well.
Some sunny day.
It's a heavily mythological moment. The song at the end by Vera Lynn, "We'll Meet Again," this is a song from the World War II era that was sung as soldiers are going off to war with the hope that they will come back. And audiences at the time, in the early 60s, mid-60s, this would have been very much alive in the cultural memory. And that suggests somehow a rebirth, that even if humanity were to get to the point of destruction and annihilation, something would come after that. That human quality, I think, is something that is there through a lot of Kubrick's work. He gets a bad rap as being misanthropic and cold. I don't think that's true at all. I think he just has a different, maybe more honest take on humanity. It's almost like he's saying, okay, we're pretty despicable as a race of beings, but we still have the capacity for humanity. There is still the capacity for compassion and art. And, you know, we were able to get off the planet. We have science. We have all these things. And so Kubrick is an artist who wants to give us experiences of humanity. And he creates that as kind of contemporary enactments of mythological stories and mythological type figures who are trying to live as human beings in a contemporary world, but those struggles speak to something larger and more universal. And I think Kubrick's films will continue to be talked about as long as people are talking about film.